there are a couple different seeds of this project. One was just years ago, I felt like my first novel would be in some way about witch trials or witch hunts, and I didn't really have any, container for that. I wrote some like weird prose poetry to that effect, and then put it aside to focus on my collection. So this was, 2014 or something that I was thinking about this. And then in 2017, sold the collection or sold the novel that was to be The Blue Maiden, based on the story of my great 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 grandfather, who was Swedish. And he has an incredible life story that's like very, very dramatic and really feels like the stuff of novels. It just sounds like a bestseller. And so, having never written a novel, I thought this is my material. It was very easy to pitch. It just sounded so compelling. And when I started writing it, I had what I thought was sort of a prologue, or, it was going to be multi-generational, multi-continental, and, very epic and span, from Sweden to his journey to America and all these kinds of things that happened there. Um, and then I kept writing about his mom and his aunt and his childhood in Sweden, which was all fictional. It was sort of the like precursor world to the information I had about him that just kept sucking me in and sort of pulling me. And those were the characters that compelled me, though they were fictional characters for the most part. Yeah, I had a few seeds of information that informed the story. But I kept thinking, like, get this Swedish childhood part out of there, and I can get on to the good book, I've sold and I'm going to write. So when I sold it, I wrote the entire book. I had a year to write it. I took a little bit longer, but that was my deadline. And it was my first deadline like that. So I took it like very, very seriously. But I finished something in that time frame. I really could not execute anything close to the level I wanted to for my book. So I had 600 pages that were just baggy, which for me was like really painful because I find the joy of the work on the sentence level, and that's like where my craft and what I do actually comes alive at all. So I also felt like maybe there was something in me that was leaning on a type of book and a type of reader that I really wanted to appeal to with this bigger project that was much more traditional, much a sweeping, historical, much more sort of epic in scope, and felt like what a novel was supposed to be, or a novel, what novel readers wanted, even though I read novels and the ones I like are much shorter and more fragmentary and play with time and lean very heavily on the sentence and the language and all of those things. But I was writing it sort of for a different person than me. And so it was when it wasn't working, I really had to reckon with that and just come back to that initial start, and say, I think this is really like the book and the core of the book. And from there it really like centered, and the plot and everything kind of came together pretty easily when I'd been quite adrift in the larger work. A few little research pieces in there that kind of helped build the work. Not that they're the most important parts of the story, but a few little dynamics that were in there. I was researching, I think she would have been my great, 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 great grandmother on a genealogy website. And it was talking about how this is not a spoiler and this is not how the book happens, but she had actually died at a young age, and then her sister had married her husband. No, so that's not the dynamic of the book, but the idea of two sisters and one man, um, the sort of triangular shape that I think you see in the book, both with there's two sisters and their father, and then the two sisters, and there's a man who comes into the picture. That there's sort of different dynamics that come out of that. But that triangle was there from the beginning. And Also the character Elias, who's kind of a smaller character, but there was a note in this research that my grandmother, great 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 grandmother, was the muse for this famous poet. Um, and so he was a Swedish romantic poet who grew up on Åland Island, which is a very sort of similar geographically to where Berggren is set, which I made up Berggren Island. It's a fictional island, but I that kind of like sparked um, that location for me, and the dynamics started brewing. And then when I rerouted from that bigger project, I was didn't have the witchcraft element in the story yet. I just had the sisters and more of their kind of older dynamic. And so I then was thinking, well, what did I like? It came back to me that I'd wanted to write about witch trials, and it all of a sudden kind of clicked. And I live on an island, so it hadn't been set on an island either. But I've been sort of walking these circles around my island, trying to figure out the book and feeling some of the isolation and kind of like pressurization of that space personally. Um, and so I just did some research of like islands, witches, Sweden. And I came across Blaukula is a real legend that existed in the witch trials in Sweden and before, and it played a large role in the trials, even across Europe, but especially in Sweden. There was a time period in the late 1600s called the Great Noyes, where close to 400 people were executed, which was not that large a number in the context of the larger European witch trials. But they had this mythology of this place, Blaukula, being Satan's home, where he lived in a tall, thin house, or and there was a trial, one particular one called the Torsaker trials in 1675, where the parish priest of a small community tried and then executed 65 women and 6 men in the church, and then walked them to their execution spot. And as they were walking, they were surrounded by their fathers and sons and brothers, and all the men in the community took them to this death. And so that made a huge impact on me to discover that, and the sort of narrative of these women flying off in the night and taking the children and taking them to Blaukula and cavorting with the devil. And it all felt like very poignant. I was thinking a lot about toxic patriarchy and traumas of our past, and the way that these traumas and violences carry forward into our present. And we feel like history is very far removed, but I think, the reality is it's not, and it ripples and echoes in all these different sort of subtler, larger ways through time. So and I was also thinking, like, we have these little isles off of our island that you can see all the time from the shore of our own island. And so I thought, well, what if there was a community next to a place, I could make up this fictional island of Berggren that would look out at the Blue Maiden is the name for the earthly sort of the geographical realm of Blaukula. So it's an actual outcropping of rock in Sweden in the ocean, and it has no inhabitants, and it's just this like stark, granite stone. Um, so what if you could see that from the shore, and like had that sort of tale associated with and this localized trauma. And in my book, I took it down from the scale of the 75 to, well, what if that happened in an insular community like an island where virtually most of the women in the region were gone overnight? Because in fact, in the real historical event, 1/5 of the women in the region were gone overnight, which to me was still staggering.